need to tell you about this place and the man who owns it. It all started a few months ago when I was desperate for a job. Bills were piling up, and honestly, I wasn't being picky. A friend of a friend mentioned a night shift gig, security work at a private residence. Sounded easy enough, right? Just sit there, watch some cameras, collect a paycheck. Boy, was I naive. The address they gave me was out in the sticks, way past where the streetlights stopped. I remember driving down this winding, overgrown lane, the trees practically meeting overhead, creating a canopy that blocked out the sky. It felt like I was entering a different world, stepping back in time. The air got colder too, even though it was a relatively warm evening. And then I saw it. Through a break in the trees, outlined against the faint glow of the distant town, stood the mansion. It wasn't just big. It was imposing, like something out of a Gothic novel. Dark stone, intricate carvings I couldn't quite make out in the fading light. And windows. So many windows, all of them dark, like vacant eyes staring out into the gloom. A shiver went down my spine, the kind you get when you know, deep down, something isn't right. But I shrugged it off, told myself it was just the atmosphere. Old houses are creepy. Everyone knows that. I pulled up to a massive wrought iron gate, rusted and adorned with what looked like grotesque gargoyles. Reached for the intercom, my finger hovering over the button. Took a deep breath. No turning back now. A gruff voice answered, distorted and crackly. "State your business." I mumbled my name and the job interview, and with a low groan, the gate swung inward, revealing a long, winding driveway choked with equally ancient trees. The path led to a circular drive, overgrown with weeds, ending at the front door. Massive, made of dark, heavy wood, studded with iron. No porch light, just the dim glow of my headlights illuminating the peeling paint, and what looked like a faded, almost indistinguishable crest above the door. I parked, killed the engine, and then it was just silence. The kind of silence that presses in on you, that makes your ears ring. No crickets, no distant traffic, just that oppressive quiet. I walked up to the door, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud on the cracked flagstones. Raised my hand to knock, but before my fist even connected, the door creaked open, revealing a sliver of darkness within. And then I saw him, the owner, Mr. Alastair Finch. He was a tall man, incredibly thin, with a stoop that made him look even taller. His face was gaunt, almost skeletal, and his eyes were the first thing that really unsettled me. They were a pale, almost translucent blue, and they seemed to bore right through you, like he was looking at something far beyond what was in front of him. His hair was long and thin, swept back from a high forehead, almost white despite his apparent age, which was hard to pinpoint. He could have been anywhere from 60 to over 100, and he wore a ridiculously old-fashioned velvet smoking jacket, even though it wasn't a smoking room, and the house felt colder than outside. "You're early," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. No warmth, no welcome, just a flat, almost accusing tone. I stammered an apology, explaining I wanted to make sure I found the place in time. He just stared at me for another beat, those unsettling blue eyes unblinking, before finally stepping back and gesturing with a bony hand. "Come in." The first thing that hit me when I stepped inside was the smell. A heavy, cloying scent of dust, old wood, and something else. Something faintly metallic, like old blood mixed with aged parchment. It was overwhelming, made my nose wrinkle instinctively. The hall was massive, stretching endlessly into the gloom. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, and absolutely no lights on. Just the faint sliver of moonlight from the open door behind me, and the even fainter, almost imperceptible glow from what I assumed were the higher windows. "I prefer the natural light," he said, as if reading my mind, even though I hadn't said anything. His voice echoed strangely in the vast space. "Follow me." He led me through a labyrinth of darkened corridors, his footsteps barely audible, while mine seemed to boom. Every few feet, I'd glimpse something in the shadows, a towering grandfather clock, its pendulum unmoving, frozen in time. A suit of armor standing guard like a forgotten sentinel. Portraits on the walls, their faces obscured by dust and shadow, their eyes seeming to follow us as we passed. The air grew heavier, colder, the deeper we went. Finally, we reached a large, cavernous room that he called the security hub. It was a small island of modernity in an ocean of antiquity. A desk, a few computer monitors displaying grainy black and white feeds from various parts of the mansion, and a simple chair. It looked out of place, almost like a piece of modern art dropped into a classical museum. "Your duties are simple," he explained, gesturing to the monitors. "Observe, report anything unusual, nothing else." His emphasis on unusual made a little alarm bell go off in my head. He then proceeded to give me the quick tour, pointing out the kitchen, which was surprisingly Spartan and seemed unused, and a small, almost hidden bathroom. He didn't show me any bedrooms, or indeed, any other living spaces. It was as if the entire mansion was a collection of empty, seldom visited rooms. "I will be elsewhere," he said, his eyes scanning the monitors, not looking at me. "Do not disturb me under any circumstances. I will contact you if I require anything. Your shift concludes at dawn. Payment will be immediate." And then, just like that, he was gone. He melted back into the shadows of the corridor, leaving me alone in that dimly lit room, surrounded by the hum of the monitors and the oppressive silence of the mansion. My first night was unsettling, to say the least. The cameras were old, the feeds constantly fuzzy, but I could make out the general layout. Long hallways, dozens of doors, staircases ascending into inky blackness. I kept glancing at the monitors, expecting to see something, anything, but nothing. Just static dust motes dancing in the faint light, and the occasional shadow that played tricks on my eyes. The silence was the worst part. It wasn't just an absence of sound. It was an active presence, a heavy blanket that smothered everything. I tried to listen for creaks, for sighs, for anything that would break the monotony, but there was nothing. Just the insistent thrum of the computers and the sound of my own breathing, which seemed ridiculously loud. Around 3 a.m, I started to feel it. A cold spot, not just a draft, but a distinct patch of intensely cold air that seemed to drift through the room. I shivered, rubbed my arms, and pulled my jacket tighter. It moved, like an invisible hand brushing past me, leaving a trail of goosebumps in its wake. I told myself it was just the old house, the faulty ventilation. Common in old mansions, right? But then I saw something on one of the monitors. It was a feed from a large, empty ballroom. Or at least, I thought it was empty. For a split second, I saw it. A faint, almost transparent flicker in the center of the room. It looked like a silhouette. Tall, slender, almost like a shadow dancing in the periphery of my vision. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. It was gone. Just the grainy feed of an empty room. I dismissed it, told myself I was tired, imagining things. The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. I kept checking that ballroom camera, but it remained stubbornly blank. Then, just as the sky outside was beginning to lighten, a faint sound reached me. A whisper, almost. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A soft, breathy murmur that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I strained to hear it again, but it was gone, absorbed by the silence. Finally, the first rays of dawn pierced through the cracks in the dusty curtains. The room, which had felt like a suffocating tomb all night, suddenly seemed a little less menacing. A faint shaft of light landed on one of the portraits in the hallway outside the security room. I peered at it. It was a woman, her face obscured by shadow and grime, but her eyes, they were pale, translucent blue, just like Mr. Finch's. A strange jolt went through me. As the sun climbed higher, Mr. Finch reappeared. He entered the room as silently as he had left, startling me. I hadn't heard him approach. He looked exactly the same as when he'd left. No sign of having slept, no change in his unsettling demeanor. "Anything to report?" he rasped, his eyes fixed on me. I hesitated. Should I mention the cold spot, the flicker, the whisper? No, I decided. I didn't want to sound like a lunatic on my first night. "No, sir, all quiet." He just nodded slowly, those pale eyes assessing me, a hint of something I couldn't decipher in their depths. As expected, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of crisp $100 bills. More money than I'd expected for a single night's work. He pressed it into my hand, his fingers surprisingly cold against mine. "You're welcome to return tomorrow evening," he said, his tone flat, offering no real invitation, just a statement. I mumbled a thank you, the money feeling almost too hot in my hand. I wanted to run, to get out of that house and never look back. But the money was good, and I was desperate. So I told myself I'd come back, just one more night. Maybe it was a fluke. Maybe I was just tired. I walked numbly out of the mansion, the heavy door swinging shut behind me with a solid thud that echoed in the pre-dawn quiet. The air outside felt fresh, pure, like a balm after the stale, oppressive atmosphere inside. I practically ran to my car, started the engine, and peeled out of the driveway, not daring to look back. I spent the entire day trying to rationalize what I had experienced. The cold spot, old pipes, the flicker, a trick of the light, dust on the lens, the whisper, my imagination. But the dread gnawed at me, a persistent little worm in the pit of my stomach. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those dark windows, those haunting blue eyes. But as night approached, the need for the money overshadowed the fear. I told myself it was just a job. A weird job, but a job. meticulously checked my car, made sure my phone was fully charged, even packed a small thermos of coffee and a sandwich, just in case. Prepared myself. Driving back down that lane was even worse in full darkness. The trees seemed to lean in closer, whispering secrets. The mansion emerged from the shadows, an even more menacing silhouette against the few stars peeking through the clouds. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. This time, the gate was already ajar. No need for the intercom. A small detail, but it unnerved me even more. It felt like the house was expecting me, waiting. I parked, took a deep breath, and walked towards the heavy door. It was slightly ajar again. No knocks needed. I pushed it open slowly, revealing the same inky blackness within, the same heavy, cloying scent. I called out, "Mr. Finch." My voice sounded small, swallowed by the vast emptiness. No answer, just the silence. I made my way to the security room, a faint sense of unease growing with every step. My eyes strained in the gloom, trying to make out familiar shapes. The grandfather clock, the suit of armor, everything exactly as I'd left it. Except the security room was different. One of the monitors was displaying a different feed. Instead of the ballroom, it was now showing what looked like a library. Towering shelves filled with ancient, leather-bound books, a large, ornate fireplace, and a massive, dust-shrouded desk in the center. But it wasn't the change in feed that caught my eye. It was what was on the desk, a single, flickering candle. And then I saw it. A figure, barely visible in the dim light, hunched over the desk, illuminated by the candle flame. Mr. Finch, unmoving, frozen. My heart hammered against my ribs. He said not to disturb him. But he was just sitting there, like a statue. Was he dead? Asleep? It felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. I finally managed to tear my eyes away from the monitor and looked around the security room. This time, the cold spot was more intense, a swirling vortex of icy air that seemed to emanate from the corner of the room. It was making the hairs on my arms stand straight up. And then I heard it again. That whisper. Closer this time, more distinct. It wasn't just a murmur, it was speech. But I couldn't make out the words. It sounded like multiple voices, soft, overlapping, like a conversation happening just beyond the threshold of hearing. It was coming from the corner where the cold spot was strongest. I froze, listening intently. Was I going crazy? Was the isolation of the house getting to me? I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again. The cold spot was still there, the voices still swirling. It sounded sad, almost mournful. I grabbed a flashlight from the desk, my hand shaking. Took a deep breath. No, I wasn't going to just sit there and be scared. I was going to investigate. This was my job, after all, to report anything unusual. And this was definitely unusual. I shone the beam into the corner. Nothing. Just the dark wooden panels, the dusty floor. But the cold was still there, so intense it was painful. And the whispers, they seemed to retreat from the light, softening, almost dying away, only to return the moment I moved the flashlight away. I sat back down, trying to calm my breathing. This was too much. This wasn't just an old house. This was something else. Something I couldn't explain. I forced myself to look back at the monitor showing the library. Mr. Finch was still there, hunched over the desk, utterly motionless. The candle flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. And then, as I watched, something happened. A faint light, like a wisp of smoke, detached itself from Mr. Finch's hunched form. It was almost transparent, indistinct, but it moved. It drifted upwards, swirling lazily for a moment, before gently settling down into the open book on the desk in front of him. Then Mr. Finch stirred. Not a dramatic movement, more like a faint shudder passing through his body. He slowly, agonizingly slowly, lifted his head. Those pale blue eyes were wide, staring blankly ahead. He looked drained, physically and emotionally exhausted. He lifted a bony hand, trembling, and gently, almost reverently, closed the book in front of him. The wisp of light vanished as the pages met. He then slumped back against the chair, his eyes still wide and unfocused, now fixed on a point in the empty room. I felt a cold dread creep over me. What was that? Was he draining something from the book? Or was something new entering him? It was too bizarre, too otherworldly. He stayed like that for a long time, unmoving. I kept watching, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm in my chest. The whispers in the security room had died down, replaced by that oppressive silence once more. The cold spot was still there, but it wasn't as intense, more like a lingering chill. As the pre-dawn light began to filter through the windows, Mr. Finch stirred again. This time, he stood up, his movements stiff, almost robotic. He blew out the candle, plunging the library into darkness once more. Then he turned and walked out of the camera's view, disappearing into the shadows. A moment later, he appeared in the doorway of the security room. He looked at me, those strange blue eyes seeming to hold an ancient weariness. "Anything to report?" he asked, his voice still low, almost a whisper. I shook my head, my throat tight. I couldn't bring myself to tell him what I'd seen. It sounded insane. He just nodded, his gaze distant, and then reached into his pocket. Another wad of money, handed it to me without a word. "You may return tomorrow evening," he said, his voice flat. It was an offer, not a question. I took the money, my fingers brushing his cold skin. "Thank you," I managed to croak. I needed to get out. I needed to think. I drove home in a daze. The images of Mr. Finch and the flickering light burned into my mind. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was witnessing something profoundly wrong, something that defied all logic and reason. This wasn't just a weird job. It was something else entirely. Something supernatural. My sleep that day was fitful, filled with fractured nightmares. Whispers, cold spots, the image of Mr. Finch slumped over that book. I woke up several times, drenched in sweat, convinced I was still in the mansion, that those pale eyes were watching me. I tried to tell myself I wouldn't go back, that the money wasn't worth it. But then the bills flashed in my mind. The rent was due, my car payment. I was trapped, or at least I felt trapped. As the sun began to set, that familiar dread began to creep back in. I paced my small apartment, arguing with myself. What if I just didn't show up? But I'd taken the money. And there was something in Mr. Finch's tone, in his demeanor, that suggested He didn't take kindly to anything that deviated from his expectations. A part of me worried about the consequences of not showing up. Another part was morbidly curious. What else would I see? What was he doing in that library? I convinced myself it was just a strange quirk. He was an eccentric old man, perhaps with some peculiar rituals. Maybe he was a writer, and that was just how he worked. The wisp of light, maybe it was just a reflection or a trick of the old monitor. I tried to find any logical explanation, anything to calm the growing panic in my chest. But deep down, I knew this wasn't normal. This was beyond normal. I packed my bag, forced down a quick meal, and got in my car. The drive was eerier than ever. The familiar ache started behind my eyes, the dull throb that foreshadowed a night of hyper-awareness and lurking fear. I saw the mansion again, even more ominous in the deepening twilight. No lights on, just a darker shadow against the dark sky. It looked like a tomb, waiting for something to awaken within its walls. I knew I was stepping into something I didn't understand, and that was the most terrifying part. Chapter 2. The next night, I was back. I know. Why would I? But the money was still a huge factor, and honestly, a part of me was just morbidly fascinated. It was like I was caught in a current, drifting towards something I couldn't understand, but couldn't quite resist either. The house felt expectant this time, even more so. The gate was again ajar, and the heavy front door was slightly ajar, almost a silent invitation. The darkness inside was a solid curtain, and that cloying smell, it was even stronger. I called out Mr. Finch's name, just like the night before, my voice swallowed by the vast emptiness. No reply. It was always just the silence. I made my way to the security room, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. This time, as I walked, I felt something brush past me, something cold and fleeting, but distinct enough to make me flinch. My heart hammered. I told myself it was just a draft, an old house settling. But I knew different. When I got to the security room, I found it just as I'd left it, except for one thing. The monitor array was still showing the library, where I'd seen Mr. Finch the previous night. And there he was again, hunched over the desk, the single candle flickering, illuminating his still form. He was in the exact same position. It was like he hadn't moved at all since I'd left that morning. A chill went through me that had nothing to do with the cold spot already forming in the corner of the room. The whispers, they were stronger this time. Not just indistinct murmurs, but almost discernible syllables, weaving in and out of each other like a chorus of ethereal voices. They were coming from the corner again, that same intense, cold spot. It was no longer just a chill. It was a biting cold that seemed to sink into my bones. I could feel the hairs on my arms and neck standing on end, despite the effort I made to smooth them down. I shone my flashlight into the corner. Nothing, just the dusty wood panels. But the sound was definitely coming from there, a faint, melancholic hum mixed with the whispers. It was like a lament, a deep, pervasive sorrow. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again, forcing myself to look at the monitor. Mr. Finch was still there, absolutely motionless. As I watched, a faint light began to glow around him, a pale, milky luminescence that seemed to emanate from his very skin. It shimmered, growing slowly, until it formed into a translucent cloud of light, almost like mist, hovering just above his head. And then, slowly, deliberately, this cloud condensed, forming into vague, human-like shapes within its swirling depths. They were indistinct, ghostly outlines, but they were there. Shadows within the light. My breath hitched. I felt a primal fear, a cold dread that went deeper than anything I'd ever experienced. This wasn't a trick of light or tiredness. This was real, and it was happening right in front of me. The air in the security room grew colder still, and the whispers intensified, now sounding more like hushed pleas, desperate and yearning. The misty figures within the light above Mr. Finch began to drift downwards, slowly, one by one, into the open book on the desk. Each time one entered the book, the luminescence around Mr. Finch dimmed slightly, and he seemed to slump a little further, as if something was being drawn out of him. It was agonizing to watch, a slow, draining process. He remained slumped for what felt like an eternity after the last wisp of light disappeared into the book. Then, with a slow, agonizing lift of his head, he stirred. His pale blue eyes were wide, vacant, staring into the dark room. He looked utterly spent, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. He reached out a trembling hand, and with a silent, heavy sigh that I could almost feel across the distance of the monitor, he closed the book. The faint light around him vanished completely. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe properly. My mind was reeling, struggling to process what I had just witnessed. Was he communing with spirits? Were they taking something from him? Or was he harvesting them? The second thought was infinitely more terrifying. He then stood up, his movements stiff and jerky, like an old man moving on aching joints. He blew out the candle, plunging the library into absolute darkness. He moved out of the camera's view, and I held my breath, waiting for him to appear in the doorway. Sure enough, a minute later, he materialized in the doorway of the security room, as silent and unexpected as a ghost. He looked at me, those translucent blue eyes holding a profound weariness, a knowledge of things that no human should ever possess. "Anything to report," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper, echoing the whispers that had just filled the room. I just shook my head, unable to speak. My throat was tight, my tongue felt thick. He simply nodded, those ancient eyes assessing me, lingering for a moment, and then reached into his pocket. The money. Another wad of crisp $100 bills. He pressed them into my hand, his fingers icy cold, as if he himself was drawing warmth from the very air around him. "You are welcome to return tomorrow evening," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. It wasn't a question, but a statement, an expectation. I mumbled a thank you, the money feeling like a burning coal in my palm. I needed to get out. I needed to process this insanity. But the thought of him, the way he seemed to drain something from the atmosphere, the way he just existed, I didn't want to cross him. Not now. I drove home in a daze. The images of the swirling light and the ghostly shapes burned into my mind. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret. Every sound was amplified. I couldn't escape the feeling that I had stumbled into a world I was never meant to see. My sleep that day was a nightmare-ridden mess. I saw the misty figures, their silent pleas, Mr. Finch's vacant eyes. I woke up in a cold sweat repeatedly, convinced I could hear faint whispers just beyond my hearing. The dread was a physical weight in my chest. I knew, with absolute certainty, that this wasn't just a job. This was something else entirely. Whatever ritual Mr. Finch was performing, it felt ancient, dark, and utterly consuming. I swore to myself I wouldn't go back. The money wasn't worth my sanity. But as evening approached, the bills, the looming financial disaster, gnawed at me. And then there was that other insidious thought, a strange, twisted curiosity. What else was there? What else would I see? I was drawn to it, almost against my will, like a moth to a dangerous flame. As the sun began to set, the familiar dread returned, but this time it was mingled with a grim determination. I would go back, but I would be prepared. I charged my phone, packed a powerful flashlight, and even brought a small knife, ridiculous as it sounds. Not that it would do anything against whatever was in that house, but it made me feel marginally better. Driving down that lane was even worse. The trees felt like skeletal arms grasping at the sky, and the mansion loomed ahead, a monstrous shadow against the fading light. This time, I gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My stomach was a tangled mess of nerves. The gate was again ajar. The front door was ajar. It was like I was expected, even welcomed, by the house itself. I pushed open the heavy door, stepping into the pervasive darkness, and the heavy, cloying scent that clung to everything. I called out Mr. Finch's name, my voice quivering slightly. No answer, just the silence. I walked through the dark, echoing hallways, my footsteps unnaturally loud. Every nerve ending was screaming, on high alert. The cold spots were more frequent now, little pockets of icy air that drifted through the corridors, making me shiver uncontrollably. And the whispers, they were constant now, a low, buzzing hum, just at the edge of comprehension. They felt closer, like they were circling me. When I reached the security room, a new wave of fear washed over me. The library feed was gone. Now, the main monitor displayed a different room. It was a massive, dimly lit chamber, unlike anything I'd seen before. Dusty tapestries hung on the walls, depicting grotesque figures and ancient battles. A huge stone altar stood in the center, dark and unadorned. And on the altar, there was a human-sized figure, covered by a heavy, dark shroud. It was utterly still, its shape indistinct beneath the fabric. My blood ran cold. Was that a body? My stomach churned, and then I saw him, Mr. Finch. He stood beside the altar, his back to the camera, his tall, gaunt frame silhouetted against the ambient gloom of the room. He was wearing the same ridiculous velvet smoking jacket, but this time, the air around him seemed to pulse with a faint, almost imperceptible energy. The whispers in the security room were no longer just whispers. They were building, growing in intensity, almost a drone. And the cold spot in the corner was a vortex. pushing icy air in palpable waves. As I watched, Mr. Finch slowly, deliberately, reached out a bony hand and pulled back a corner of the shroud on the altar. I gasped. It was indeed a body. A skeletal hand, long and thin, emerged from beneath the cloth. It was ancient, desiccated, like something taken from a tomb. And then I saw the face. It was a skull, but with remnants of dried skin stretched tightly over the bone, and empty eye sockets that seemed to stare into eternity. It was horrifying. Mr. Finch slowly, reverently, uncovered the rest of the body. It was a mummified corpse, perfectly preserved, lying on the altar. It looked like it had been there for centuries. The air in the security room grew thick, oppressive, making it hard to breathe. The whispers now sounded like a frantic chorus, a desperate plea. Mr. Finch then did something I never could have imagined. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out a small, ornate silver flask. He uncorked it, and a faint, sweet, metallic scent wafted from the liquid inside, even through the monitor. He then slowly, deliberately, poured the contents of the flask over the mummified corpse. As the liquid touched the ancient remains, a violent reaction occurred. The corpse began to shimmer, a faint, sickly green light emanating from its decaying form. It pulsed, growing brighter with every drop, and the skeletal hand on the altar began to twitch, ever so slightly. My jaw dropped. I was witnessing something utterly impossible, something evil. The voices in the security room erupted into a cacophony of panicked whispers and low moans, a desperate chorus of fear and sorrow. The cold spot in the corner flared, becoming so intense my teeth began to chatter. Mr. Finch just stood there, unmoving, watching the glowing corpse. His head was tilted slightly, as if listening intently to something I couldn't hear. The green light pulsed faster, and the ancient body began to expand. Not dramatically, but subtly, like it was slowly reinflating, reabsorbing something. Then, the most terrifying thing happened. The mummified corpse began to visibly de-age. The dried skin plumped, the wrinkles smoothed, the sunken eyes slowly, sickeningly, filled with a cloudy, milky substance that began to take on a pale blue hue. Hair, thin and white, began to sprout from the skull. It was like watching a time lapse of reverse decay, a gruesome rebirth. It was transforming into a living, breathing form, a form that was starting to look eerily familiar. The long, thin hair, the gaunt features, the pale blue eyes, it was becoming younger, but it was becoming Mr. Finch. As the transformation neared completion, the whispers in the security room reached a fever pitch, a primal scream of sorrow and anguish that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the house. The cold spot in the corner was like a physical entity, pressing in on me, suffocating me. I could feel tears stinging my eyes, not from physical pain, but from the unbearable sadness and horror emanating from the unseen voices. Finally, the transformation ceased. Lying on the altar was a younger version of Mr. Finch, perhaps a man in his late 20s or early 30s, albeit incredibly pale, and with eyes that held the same ancient, weary wisdom. He was breathing, his chest rising and falling slowly. Mr. Finch, the older version, stood silently beside the altar, his back still to the camera. He simply raised one bony hand and gently, almost delicately, placed it on the forehead of the younger, revived version of himself. As his hand touched the skin, a faint, reddish glow sparked between them, like a transfer of energy. Then, the younger Mr. Finch on the altar stirred. His eyes opened. They were the same pale, unsettling blue. He looked directly at the camera, directly at me. And in those ancient eyes, there was a flash of something I couldn't comprehend: recognition. Or perhaps something far more sinister. The old Mr. Finch then slowly, finally, turned to face the camera, to face me. His face was gaunt, almost translucent, as if he had just given something of himself away. He looked directly into the lens, his pale blue eyes boring through me. And in that moment, the raw intensity of his gaze was pure malice. Not anger, not hatred, but a cold, ancient malevolence that seemed to strip me bare. The whispered chorus in the security room abruptly ceased. The cold spot vanished instantly. The oppressive silence returned, heavier and more profound than ever before. It was as if whatever had been there, whatever had been whispering, had been silenced, absorbed, or destroyed. Mr. Finch just stood there, staring at me through the monitor. He didn't say anything. He didn't move. He just watched, his gaze unblinking. I felt a cold dread creep over me, knowing that he had known I was watching, that he had known about the whispers, about the fear. He was aware of everything. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he stepped forward and reached out his hand, precisely as if he was reaching for the monitor itself. And then the screen flickered, went to static, and then went completely, utterly black. The silence in the security room was absolute. Only the hum of the remaining monitors, showing empty corridors, filled the void. My own breathing was ragged, shallow. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I felt like I was going to throw up. I knew in that moment I couldn't stay. I didn't care about the money. I didn't care about anything but getting out. He knew I had seen. And that cold, malevolent stare, it promised consequences. I scrambled out of the chair, my legs unsteady. I grabbed my bag, my flashlight, anything I thought I might need. I practically ran from the security room, not bothering to be quiet. I just needed to escape. The darkness of the mansion felt even more suffocating now. A hungry presence that seemed to close in around me with every step. I felt eyes on me, felt a cold breath on my neck, but I didn't dare look back. I burst out of the massive front door, gulping in the cold night air. It purified my lungs, but did nothing to calm my frantic heart. I didn't even bother to close the door behind me. I just ran to my car, fumbling with the keys, my hands trembling so violently I almost dropped them. I started the engine, threw it into reverse, and peeled out of the driveway, gravel spitting from under the tires. I didn't look back. I just drove fast down the winding, overgrown lane, the mansion a huge, dark presence in my rearview mirror, until the trees finally swallowed it from sight. I drove straight home, adrenaline pumping through my veins, making my body thrum with a terrible energy. I didn't sleep that day. I just sat in my apartment, the lights on, every window and door locked, staring blankly at the walls. My mind replayed the images over and over again. The mummified corpse, the green light, the horrifying de-aging process, the young Mr. Finch, and then that stare. The cold, ancient malice of the old Mr. Finch's eyes directly into the camera, into my soul. I tried to rationalize it, to find some shred of logic, but there was none. What I had witnessed defied everything I knew about life and death. He was drawing something from that mummified corpse, something that made him younger, renewed him. And the whispers, the spirits, were they being used in this horrifying ritual? Were they being consumed? That was the most terrifying thought of all. I knew I couldn't go back. Not ever. The money wasn't worth it. My sanity, my very life, wasn't worth it. I didn't know what he was or what he was doing, but I knew I had witnessed something deeply unnatural, something that should have remained hidden. I called the friend of a friend who had referred me. My voice was tight, strained. I tried to sound casual, but the words came out shaky. Yeah, hey, about that job, it's not really for me. Too far, and a little too quiet for me. I tried to laugh, but it came out as a pathetic squeak. My friend's voice was confused. Oh, really? That's a shame. Heard the pay was really good. Mr. Finch is a bit odd, but he's harmless. Harmless. The word echoed in my mind, a sick, cruel joke. Yeah, well, just not a good fit, I mumbled, trying to end the conversation quickly. I couldn't tell him what I'd seen. Who would believe me? They'd think I was crazy. I spent the next few days in a fog of fear and paranoia. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking presence. Every creak of my apartment building made me jump. I kept checking my windows, convinced those pale blue eyes were staring at me from the darkness outside. I felt watched constantly, like some ancient, malevolent entity silently recognized me, remembered me. I threw the money Mr. Finch had given me into a drawer, unable to spend it. It felt tainted, a price paid for witnessing something unspeakable. I knew I needed it, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. It was a tangible link to that horrifying place, to that ancient, terrifying man. I started looking for other jobs, any job. I didn't care what it was. I just needed to move forward, to try and forget. But I knew I never would. The image of the mummified corpse reanimating, of Mr. Finch's truly malevolent gaze, it was burned into my memory. I haven't been back to that mansion. I drive miles out of my way to avoid even going near that winding lane. The thought of it, even now, sends shivers down my spine. I still have nightmares, vivid and terrifying, of those pale blue eyes, of the whispers, of the cold, oppressive silence. I don't know what Mr. Finch is. I don't know the full extent of his rituals, or what he does with that renewed version of himself. Is it a clone, a new body? Is he somehow transferring his consciousness? I don't know. And honestly, I don't want to know. Some mysteries are best left undisturbed, especially when they involve ancient evils and the manipulation of life and death. All I know is this: I will never go back. Not for any money, not for any reason. I escaped that house, and I count myself lucky to be alive and relatively sane to tell the tale. And if you ever hear about a night shift security job at a desolate, Gothic mansion owned by a gaunt man with unsettlingly pale blue eyes, just run. Don't even look back. Some things are best left unknown.